Good evening, and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Yale Needs Women, with author Anne Gardiner Perkins and two of the women who enrolled at Yale College in 1969, part of the first class to accept women for the first time. My name is Deborah Hoffman, and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Anne Gardiner Perkins will first give us some context of what Yale was like around 1969, and then she'll interview Laurie Mifflin and Shirley Daniels, two of the women who were in that groundbreaking class. Then they'll field questions from the audience. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube, and feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Anne Gardiner Perkins' book, Yale Needs Women, tells the story of the tumultuous early years of coeducation at Yale. It's the winner of the 2020 Connecticut Book Award for Nonfiction and was named by BookBrowse as one of the top 12 books for book clubs in 2021. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and my warm greetings to all of you who've joined us this evening for this event sponsored by the Waltham Public Library. Over the next hour, we're going to explore together that point in our nation's history when America's most prestigious colleges, when Yale and its peers finally ended their ban on women students. It was 1969, a time not unlike our own, when individuals were raising their voices against long-standing discrimination against women and African Americans. The world was churning. The Black Power movement was changing how Americans saw race. The Vietnam War was raging, as was the protest against it. The Stonewall riots had just laid bare the discrimination faced by gay men and women. And into that moment stepped the first women undergraduates at Yale. What happened next? Well, that's what we're going to find out. And I can't emphasize enough how lucky we are to have with us tonight two of the women who lived that history, Shirley Daniels and Laurie Mifflin. Before Shirley and Laurie join me, I want to give you a brief overview of the tumultuous early years of coeducation at Yale. And we're going to do that by looking together at some historic photographs from this era. So I want to begin by having you picture Yale as it was before those first women arrived. And to do so, imagine a village of men. This is the class of 1916 football cheerleaders. The cheerleaders, of course, are all men. And that is actually Prescott Bush, this tall one in the middle, who was became a US Senator and was the grandfather of President George W. Bush. If you entered any classroom at this time and looked along the rows of students, every single one of them would be men. No women were allowed. So too in the dining halls and in the dormitories. What women there were existed in the shadows, the dining hall workers, the secretaries, the odd handful of women graduate students. Yale, however, was an extreme at this time, but it wasn't an aberration. This is a list of US colleges that don't admit women students in 1968. You can see 6 of our more prominent Massachusetts colleges on this list: Amherst, Boston College, Harvard, Holy Cross, Tufts, and Williams. Yale, of course, is the most extreme. It had not had women students for its 268 years of history. It was the oldest all-male club in the country at the time. Yale's announcement that it was going co-ed and Princeton's a few months later finally lifts this coeducation taboo in America's most elite colleges, and a wave of coeducation sweeps through this list of schools, changing higher education in America forever. So who were those first women students at Yale? The New York Times called them superwomen, but as you can see, most of them are just teenagers. They came from all over the country, from Los Angeles, Houston, Baltimore. No state except for Connecticut and New York sent more women to Yale that first year than did Massachusetts. We were number 3 in terms of the numbers of women students. The women were in some cases wealthy, but others had to patch together their tuition with financial aid jobs and summer work. Most of them were white, but 40 of those first women students were African American, 13 were Asian American, 3 were Latina. They were smart and they were tough. That's how Yale picked them this first year. I interviewed one of the 2 administrators who chose that first group of women, and I'll never forget what he told me. There was no point in taking a timid woman and putting her in this environment because it could crush you. I've always loved this photograph. This is a woman in the very first week of coeducation, one of the first year students walking across what was called Yale's old campus, where the first year students were all housed. And I like how she's standing straight and looking strong, striding across that campus. I also like how this photo captures this sort of sense of isolation and loneliness felt by many of those first women students. Yale might have called itself co-ed that first year, but just 13% of the undergraduate student body were women because of a quota that Yale put in place to keep the number of women to a minimum. The flip side, as one of them wrote, I didn't want to forget to tell you this, I could walk for blocks at night and never see another woman's face. The flip side of that isolation was a sort of a sense of exposure. So this news of Yale going co-ed was a national story, front page of the New York Times, and reporters, particularly in the first month or 2, were everywhere. This young woman has just walked out of the building where she's registered for the first time to be a student at Yale, and she's besieged by this reporter with this camera here. Asking her questions of what it was like to be a woman at Yale, as if she knew already. Of course, the story that reporters told fit often their image of what they thought they would see or what they wanted to see. This is from a photo spread that was done in Look magazine. It's now defunct, but you could think of it as quite similar to Life magazine and how it covered things and what its prominence was. And what do we see here? We don't see a powerful woman or a smart woman. We see a woman barely clothed, wrapped in a towel, talking on the telephone with curlers in her hair. It was challenging to be one of those first women at Yale. They were isolated. Yale divided them up in small groups and distributed them across its 12 residential colleges so that each group of men would have its own small cluster of women. The phrase sexual harassment had not yet been invented when they got there, but that didn't mean it was going on. And they had few women mentors. Of Yale's 407 tenured faculty members, just 3 were women. But I wanted to show you this photo too. That's Judy Burkhand, Barbara Deinhardt, 2 of the first women undergraduates at Yale, and they're dancing. So joy and laughter is also part of this experience. It's really necessary to sustain the women. And so I wanted to make sure you saw that that was part of it as well. Now, when I started doing this research, I had sort of this fuzzy idea that the reason Yale had admitted women had something to do with the women's movement. Let me go back a second. When I decided to write this book, I didn't want to tell it from above. I wanted to tell it through the eyes of 5 of the women students who lived this history. I wanted readers to really be able to experience it for itself. So Laurie and Shirley are 2 of the women who feature in Yale Needs Women. Connie Royster is one of the others. Connie grew up in New Haven. She went to church every Sunday in a church 2 blocks from Yale's campus. Her grandfather and some of her older relatives worked for Yale as chefs and managers in Yale's fraternities and secret societies. Her grandmother had co-founded the NAACP in New Haven, and her aunt, for whom she was named, Constance Baker Motley, was the first African-American woman to be appointed as a federal judge. But none of them had been able to go to Yale as students. So when Connie was accepted, it became an accomplishment, not just for her, but for her family. This is Elizabeth Spahn, who went by the name Betty when she was at Yale. She's one of the other 5 women whose stories Yale Needs Women follows, and she was Connie's roommate the very first year of Yale, and they've remained lifelong friends. Elizabeth was in fact hoping to join us tonight, but she has been felled by some sort of terrible flu, so I am very grateful to Laurie for joining us. Her family was pretty much the opposite of Connie's. They really didn't want her to go to Yale. She grew up in a conservative, Republican, religious Midwestern family who were suspicious of Eastern values and didn't understand why the University of Illinois, where Elizabeth's mom had gone to school, wasn't good enough for her. But in Betty's very first month or two at Yale, she had two very shocking experiences that led to her becoming very quickly a feminist. And in the May of the very first year of coeducation, she's a co-founder of the Yale Sisterhood, Yale's first undergraduate women's group. And she co-founds it with a woman named Kit McClure, a first-year student, the fifth woman who's followed in Yale Needs Women. Now, this photograph of Kit playing the saxophone may not seem shocking now, but at the time it was. The saxophone was a men's instrument. Women didn't play saxophone. They didn't play trombone either. In fact, when Kit was in high school and told her parents she wanted to learn how to play the trombone, they forbid it because girls didn't play trombone. But she learned how to play anyway, and she taught herself saxophone. And her first year at Yale, she was the only woman in the Yale marching band, the first woman to be able to join. She had bigger ideas, though, and hoped to start a all-women's rock band. And that is part of her story as well. So as I said, I had this fuzzy idea that all of this had something to do with the women's movement, right? But the chronology is all wrong. The women's movement and the peak of it follows Yale's decision to admit women. This book, Sisterhood is Powerful, is part of the wave of feminist books that come out, but it's not published until September 1970, almost 2 years after Yale decides to admit women students. Instead, there are really two things pushing Yale to go co-ed. One of them is the activism by male students. So this is a replica of a poster that a guy named Derek Shearer, student at Yale, papered all over Yale's campus in September of 1968. That's the actual photo of his younger sister, Brooke, that was in the poster. And the question he asks is, please, Mr. Brewster, why can't I come to Yale? This is the Mr. Brewster he was talking about, the president of Yale at the time. And if Brewster had had his way, Yale would never have admitted women students. Yale and Brewster saw their mission as graduating national leaders, 1,000 leaders each year to be exact. And because men are leaders and women are not, or so they thought, they felt that none of those leaders should be women. 1,000 male leaders was the phrase that almost every Yale woman at that time knew. But here is the problem for Brewster. The future male leaders that Yale hoped to admit were in increasing numbers turning Yale down because they wanted to go to campuses that either had women students or had a sister college like Harvard did with Radcliffe. And so if it wanted to remain competitive, if it wanted to keep attracting the top men, Yale needed to admit women. And that's what it did. Two last photos I want to show you before Shirley and Laurie join me that have to do with some stories we're going to talk about. This is a Yale woman field hockey player, Susan Morse, in the 4th year of coeducation. How do I know it's the 4th year? Because she's actually wearing a Yale uniform. In the early years of coeducation at Yale, when they're just trying to get that team started, the women are told to wear jean cutoffs, their own, and t-shirts that they purchase at the Yale co-op. In the 2nd year of coeducation, after Laurie and her teammates have fought and fought and fought to have a team, they actually gave them their first one coach. It's a mom of a Yale student who teaches phys ed at a nearby high school and comes 2 days a week after work to coach the Yale women. This is at a time when the Yale football team has 8 coaches. But there are many challenges this team faces, and we'll hear some more about that story. The other photo I want to show you is from May 1st, 1970. And what is happening there is that 30,000 protesters came in from all over the country into New Haven because of a trial that was going on in the New Haven courthouse, which is just 2 blocks from Yale, on 9 Black Panthers, including National Black Panther leader Bobby Seale and New Haven Black Panther leader Erica Huggins, had been charged with murder, and a charge that was never, they were never convicted of eventually. And the protests and the fear of violence from all these protesters coming in all over the country was such that the Connecticut governor called in the National Guard, and 2,000 Marines and 2,000 paratroopers from North Carolina were flown up and stationed nearby. We'll hear a little more about that story when Shirley and Laurie join me. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce both Shirley and Laurie. This is Shirley's photo from her Yale yearbook. Shirley grew up in a military family and as a child attended Army-based schools that never had more than a few Black kids. By middle school, her family settled in Roxbury, Boston's historic Black neighborhood. Shirley graduated from Hyde Park High, where she'd been bused as a high school student, and enrolled in Boston's Simmons College. The following year, Yale began accepting women students, and Shirley was one of 8 Black women accepted into the sophomore class. She was a leader in the Black Student Alliance at Yale and chaired the group's largest committee, Recruitment, Tutorial, and Counseling. After graduating, she worked for Yale Upward Bound, and then went on to a legal career in New York City, including serving as an assistant district attorney and as general counsel for Paragon Cable Manhattan. Shirley then enrolled in New York Theological Seminary, received her Master's of Divinity, and was ordained at Canaan Baptist Church of Christ in Harlem under Dr. Wyatt T. Walker. She is now a Baptist minister. Laurie is the one on the left here. She likes to point out the short one. Oh, sorry about that. The short one, oh, blimey, whose foot is not touching the ground. Why is that not going back? Oh, I'm so sorry. All right, you're gonna have to remember that photograph. Laurie grew up in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And there, you guys can start to join me now if you want. And attended Swarthmore's Public High School, arriving at Yale in 1969 in the freshman first-year class. Shocked to find that Yale did not offer any sports for women, she led the efforts to start Yale's first field hockey team. In her senior year, Yale awarded the team varsity status. Laurie has spent her career in journalism, a path begun in large part because of the Yale Daily News and its aversion to covering women's sports. Fed up with the absence of women from the paper's sports pages, Laurie volunteered to cover Yale's women's teams. Within 3 years of graduating, she became the first woman sports writer for the New York Daily News. She later moved to the New York Times, where she worked for 30 years as reporter, editor, and executive. Laurie currently serves as the managing editor of the Hechinger Report, a nonprofit independent news organization dedicated to covering education. So welcome, ladies. And Laurie and Shirley, why don't you unmute now so we can see you and get started.
Hi.
Hi, Laurie. Hi, Shirley.
Hi.
Shirley, why don't I start the questions with you and your work with the Black Student Alliance at Yale? And so you take part in a huge number of initiatives towards that goal of promoting equity, from that BSAY committee that you chair, to your meetings with other Black women students, to your sessions with Sam Chauncey, who's one of Yale's top administrators. What were some of the problems you sought to change, and where do you think you were most effective?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'd like to say hello to our wonderful host. And thank you for Waltham Library, Public Library, for offering this opportunity for us to share. To answer your question, I came to Yale, I guess, for primarily to become a student of the Afro-American Studies program. When I got to Yale, I became involved with the BSAY, or the Black Student Alliance at Yale, because there are a number of issues that we were trying to address and had been started by the male college students before us, when they were heading up the BSAY, and we women sort of joined in with the cause. We recognized that there weren't enough faculty. There were hardly any faculty. In the residential colleges, there weren't any heads of the colleges who were Black. Ultimately, they brought in Professor Goldsby, who was over in Pearson, I guess my third or my last year at Yale, and he and his wife really kind of helped us, Blacks who were on campus. For me, it was about recruiting. That's what I was called to do. We wanted to make sure that there was an adequate pipeline of students, Black students coming in, and not just from affluent Black communities, but also from communities like the one I came from, which is Roxbury in Boston, Massachusetts, but other low-income communities across the country. So with some funding from Yale through Sam Chauncey, we were able to send out Black students to help with the recruiting in those kinds of communities to get a more diverse Black population coming into the university. There was also, I'll just say one other thing, there was also an issue that Black women had. We were few and far between, and not only were we dealing with the fact that we were few women on the college campus, we were also few Black women among all the Black men that were out there. And we were constantly being bombarded with their attentions. I guess that's the best way to put it. The fresh women had the hardest time. A woman by the name of Vera Wells, who's mentioned in your book, and took me under her wing. She was a year ahead of me. And we worked on getting the Black women together to try to support each other, because there was just so much pressure by the men on the women who were there. It fell apart because the men put so much pressure on the women to attend. They were afraid of us getting together that we just never really got it off the ground that first year. But then as things went on, we found that we got together in little cliques. So let me just stop there and turn it back over to you, Anne.
Okay. And I think that challenge of having all the men want to go out with you is not just one faced by the Black women at Yale, but certainly by the white women. Right. I mean, many of them will talk. There was a story that really surprised me of a woman who said she was walking across the Yale campus, and a male student asked her, "Are you so-and-so?" And he had recognized her because he had memorized the photos in the Yale Facebook and the names of the women he thought were pretty, and she was one of them. And that's how he knew who she was. So Laurie, I'm so sorry I went through that photo so quickly, but it did show you in that, again, that final year at Yale, and that's your Yale team captain photo with you and Susan Morse, and it's a controversial photo. And why is it? It looks pretty dull now.
Yeah, Sandy is what she's called, but
I'm sorry.
But her proper name is Susan. Yeah. Sandy's about 5'10" and I'm about 5' nothing. So the picture was funny, but the picture had significance. For those of you who don't know anything about Yale traditions, there's a tradition that the captains of the varsity athletic teams have their picture taken at the end of their season on the fence. The fence is allegedly a part of the campus that dates back to the original campus, the very first days in the 1700s or whatever. And they've preserved it and they keep it in the basement of the gymnasium for this purpose, to let people have their picture taken when they are a captain of a varsity team. The significance of the picture you showed, Anne, is that there were two of us on that fence. And that's the only time in Yale history that there have been two people taken on that fence. And that was because the prior year, when we were, Sandy and I were elected co-captains of the field hockey team, and it was not yet a varsity sport, the following fall, it became a varsity sport, and Yale said we had to choose one of us to be the captain. And we said, no, we wouldn't. We were elected by the team to be co-captains, and we were going to be co-captains. And we ended up somehow, letting that picture get taken and letting that happen, that we are co-captains in the annals of Yale athletics history. So it's not very important, but it's kind of fun story.
Yeah, well, and to me, as the wonky academic historian, it is important because what you're doing is challenging Yale's idea that hierarchy is always one person at the top, that leadership is always one person at the top, by saying, you know what, we're a team here and there are two of us and we work together and you can't pull that apart. I think one of the other things that's so interesting about women's athletics at Yale is the visibility it gives you, that ability to wear the Y on your chest and represent Yale. And so, as Laurie said, there was this tradition of the team captains having their photo taken in front of the Yale fence, and then a tradition of those photos being hung in Maury's, which is the restaurant where Yale's faculty met and Yale's president would have lunch. Yeah. And it wasn't until 1981 that Maury's deigned to add the photos of the women sports captains to those of the men. So it really fights in many ways having women being seen as leaders and in those leadership roles.
But Yale also just fights the changing of any of its traditions.
Yes. Yeah. Which were male.
And that's as much a part of it as the male-female thing, I think. But sports is particularly, what's the word? It's contentious, because back then, that's another thing people don't remember. It wasn't nearly as common for women to play sports at all. And many of us grew up in high school thinking sports was not for girls.
Well, Title IX it's not passed until the summer of 1972, but it doesn't go into effect for sports until 1978. So it doesn't even affect you when you're a student at Yale. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me about the BSAY, Shirley, is that you attain that leadership role and Sheila Jackson becomes treasurer in that very first year of the BSAY. I mean, do you think I'm wrong in saying the BSAY was quicker to accept women leaders than other areas of Yale?
I think that's a nice way to put it. We had to fight as hard as anybody else to get positions, to be heard. There were times when we were going in as an organization, the leadership would go in to negotiate something with Brewster or with Chauncey. And I always found it very interesting that I would put an idea out there and there would be no response. And about 2 minutes later, a guy would put the same idea out there, in fact, use my language. And all of a sudden, it was something to be discussed. And it was just, we ran into the same kind of male resistance in the organization. As I'm aware that other women were running into as well. So it was interesting that Sheila was treasurer and not convener, which is the equivalent of the president of the organization. It's interesting that I got recruitment, tutorial, and counseling, which is of the kind of things that are acceptable for women to be pursuing. Not to mention, it was just my calling to be in all of that. But I did note when I was there that it was kind of interesting that we were not in other kinds of leadership positions at BSAY. Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to mention one thing following on what Laurie said. I played basketball in high school. And even though I'm 5'4", I could jump and I had a mean outside shot. In Boston, for those of you who remember, girls were not allowed to dribble the ball more than 3 dribbles. Then we had to stop and pass the ball off to somebody else.
Yeah.
They divided the court in half.
Yep.
So unless you were a roving player which was 2 players off of each team. I was roving forward because I wasn't going to stay on my side of the line. That was just crazy. Everyone else had to stay on their side of the court, right? So any hopes of any kind of, I mean, I look on with envy when I saw that basketball for women was starting to take off many, many years after I graduated. But my story about Yale is I went over to the gym. I was looking for the girls' basketball team that they were supposed to start. And I was told, well, we don't really offer that, but I think they're putting together a dance class upstairs, and you can go and look into that. I looked at it for a hot second, and then I came all the way downstairs because I was trying to find a bathroom. And as you know, it's an antiquated, huge monstrosity of a building. The bathrooms for the women were all the way downstairs in the basement, back behind the boilers somewhere. And all the classes were up on the top floor, which was the 3rd floor. So, and then there were male bathrooms in between. So that's my little addition to the sports. I gave up sports as a possibility at that school.
And can we talk about how parallel that is?
Yeah.
I knew that, Shirley. I never knew that story.
Neither did I.
But my story, which is told in Anne's book, is that I came from the Philadelphia area, which, unlike Boston, was very strong for women's sports and girls' sports early on. I mean, my mother's generation, people played field hockey, but basketball did have those rules that that Shirley's talking about: 2 forwards, 2 rovers, and 2 guards, and you had to stay on your side or the other if you weren't a rover. But it changed, I think, while we were at Yale. But I went to the athletic department in complete innocence, thinking that all over the country, girls played field hockey in the fall and lacrosse in the spring, and either basketball or gymnastics in the wintertime. I really did. I thought that was the norm. So I went to the athletic department and I asked where to sign up for the field hockey team. And the man was completely baffled. And just like what you Shirley, he said, we've made the swimming pool available and the running track here in the big gymnasium, the big fancy Yale gymnasium. Oh, and you can play tennis on the tennis courts out by the Yale Bowl. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with this man? I didn't ask to play tennis. I didn't ask to run or swim. I want to play field hockey. And he said, well, I don't know really what you're talking about, but we don't have that. And that's why this other woman from Philadelphia, not coincidentally, and I started the field hockey team.
Wow. Wow. I don't want to forget to talk about May Day, since I showed that photo, and it's kind of an intense photo. And Shirley, in the lead up to May Day, you were really concerned about the potential of violence, and particularly the risk being posed to the students in the city of New Haven. Can you talk a little bit more about why you were worried and what you did to make those concerns heard?
Yeah, there were 3 inner city high schools in New Haven. And in fact, I had taught at one for a semester of teaching course that I was taking because I was contemplating becoming a teacher at the time. But just before, I can't even tell you the time frame, but before May Day was to occur, some representatives from Boston's Black Panther Party came down to heighten the contradictions. And one of the guys I happen to know, I was concerned because they were going into the high schools and encouraging the students to come out to heighten the contradictions.
What does that mean? What does that phrase mean, heighten the contradictions?
My understanding of it is that the idea is that you are confrontational whenever you come in contact with anybody in authority who's white. You stand your ground instead of being subservient, which is what we are taught to do from birth. And when you do that, given the way police are, as people are finding out now, and the community has been screaming about for generations, they're very quick to get physical with you, if not violent. So the idea was they wanted to show the community that these are bad folks, and that the community would be so riled up with the violence and the brutality that there would be a revolution. That didn't happen because the community is not monolithic. And but that's what it was. They were trying to get the kids out of the school, and it worked. The kids were walking out. I remember walking over to the school, and I saw the kids walking out and stuff like that. We in the BSAY, the night before May Day was supposed to happen, that leading up to that week when all the troops were up and lining the campus and what have you, we'd gotten word that there were some students out there with BB guns who were firing indiscriminately at people walking by. And so some of the brothers in the organization partnered up with men from the Nation of Islam to go and patrol the communities, to find these kids, to get them off the street before something happened, if in fact that was what was really happening. We had just heard that it was, and the whole idea was to snuff it in the bud and get those kids off the street. They must have been successful because nothing came of it, nothing was in the news. So the brothers did come back and say, they found a couple of kids who were, out to kind of see what was going on, and they shuffled them back home to their parents. But yeah, that's kind of what we were concerned about. And then the university itself asked our leadership for advice on how the university should liaise with the Black community, since all these white folks were coming down on May Day, from across the country, and purportedly in support of the New Haven Nine. And so, they consulted with us. We gave them some suggestions on how to handle what might be happening. We would do our part to try to, work with other community organizations to kind of keep the community out of this, because we didn't really feel like the May Day protests were about us. They were more about the peace movement and the hippies and all of that that was associated with all that. And it just kind of culminated in 100,000 people descending upon the Common in New Haven that weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it was Abby Hoffman, who's the co-founder of the radical left Yippies, who's the one that proclaims that this protest in New Haven is going to be the biggest riot in history. And it's he who's really revving people up to come to New Haven. I think it's really worth pointing out. So this protest in New Haven, 30,000 people, that's a lot of people for that a relatively small city. May 1st, no one is killed. There is not any massive violence or any destruction. And just 3 days later, May 4th, at Kent State, with a much smaller student protest, 4 students are killed by the National Guard. So while I point out that Kingman Brewster was not a friend to equity for women, he really was quite a brilliant campus president when it came to this particular protest at Yale, by opening up the university to the protesters instead of letting Yale become a target. So Laurie, you were at the protest. About a third of the Yale student campus leaves. They and their parents hear there's going to be all this massive violence, get out of there. But like Shirley, you stayed at Yale that weekend. Can you tell me a little bit about it? I know you were down on the New Haven Green as part of the protest. Why were you there, and what happened? What was it like?
Well, I mean, I will have to first emphasize that I was 18 years old. And one reason I was there was because I was just still learning about the world, and I wanted to see what it was all about. I didn't have strongly developed political instincts. I did not have the kind of activist gene and calling that Shirley's talked about having, for a lot of obvious reasons. I mean, I grew up a much more sheltered existence, I think, and certainly absent racism. But I was very eager to learn what it was that people were protesting about and how it was going to happen. And of course, many of my fellow students were there too. We went together. My greatest memory is that either Abby Hoffman or Jerry Rubin was standing on the dais shouting, "Can I use bad language at the Waltham Library gathering?"
Why don't you use the word, use the letter F instead of
Okay,
the whole.
F. Kingman Brewer. He didn't even get his name right. F. Kingman Brewer. F. Trying to get people to chant this, which I thought was really beside the point, because Kingman Brewster had even said that he didn't think the Black Panthers who were on trial in New Haven there could get a fair trial. So I was learning a lot. I was disillusioned by those guys. I then had to run up Elm Street, or which I forget which street it is, because although not many people were injured, tear gas canisters were thrown to disperse us, I guess, toward evening. I remember that. The other thing I remember about that whole event is that because Brewster, and also someone that Shirley mentioned who doesn't get enough credit, Sam Chauncey, because they had been very careful about how to open the university and make it feel welcoming to all the protesters, most of the college courtyards were open, serving food to people for free. And I remember working at my college's courtyard, we were serving chili or granola, or depending what time of day it was. And we had a rotation where we all helped out with serving the free food to people. So it's a very impressionistic memory in that sense, because I wasn't involved in any organizing, but it was a very exciting time. You felt like you were part of something that was maybe going to really change society. Don't really know if it did, but we were trying.
Shirley, any other thoughts about May Day, or do you want to talk about where you ended up during the protest itself?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Yale has these secret societies, and they are 12 of them are big, huge stone monstrosities, but they look like tombs. And so they, the nickname for them are tombs. And the tomb that we were in was Wolf's Head, which was right next to the Yale Theater, and not more than a half block away from the Commons, or the city Commons. You have to forgive me, my cat seems to want to be on Zoom, on YouTube. The men in the organization thought it would be better for us women to stay in Wolf's Head out of danger while they went out to check out what was going on. Now, one of the women, I'll have to say her name was Tony, she actually said, "This is nonsense. I'm going out," and she went out to see what was going on. The tear gas did come in as far up as where we were and came down into the tombs, and we were all choking and coughing and everything. I mean, they did not spare any expense when it came to throwing the tear gas. But we were kind of furious because we were supposed to be there on the home front, cooking up chicken and food and all this other kind of stuff. So when the men came back, they would be taken care of. And we did it. We did it. We stayed in because we're of that generation. And so it changed over time, and it certainly has changed over time. But that's what happened. That's what happened.
Well, we're getting to the point where we need to turn it back to Deborah for any questions we might have from the audience. But before we do so, I just want to say how remarkable I think both of you are, and how Yale changed because of what you did there and what you did as young women, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old. I think there was a line by a woman in your class, Laurie, who wrote that, coeducation is something that men at Yale think happened to women. But women made sure coeducation was something that happened to Yale. And that was a good thing indeed.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a
So
great
Deborah,
line.
any questions that you've got that we can answer for the audience members?
Yes, actually. Hang on, this is a question that someone texted me. So this is for Shirley and Laurie. As Yale women, what do you think about the autobiography, There Will Be No Miracles Here by Casey Gerald? From a women's perspective, what do you think of his alienating Yale experience? I don't know if you're familiar with the book. I am not.
I am not either, Shirley.
I am not.
Me neither.
I am not. But
I will make a
given
point.
the question,
I'd like to make one
Go
point.
ahead.
This is something that one of the pictures that Anne showed in the beginning of the people dancing and laughing. A lot has been written about how awful and difficult it was to be amongst the first women at Yale. And in many ways it was. And we could all have our stories about bad things that happened, but there was so much joy and laughter too. And I think a lot of it, I often say that my roommates and I often say this, some of it was a matter of luck. Shirley and the folks who came in as transfers from another college, and Anne mentions they were put into into each residential college, divided up among them so that there were only a handful. Those of us who came as freshmen, fresh women, we were all in one big dorm, 250 of us. So you got to know a lot of other women, and those friendships could follow you out, even if you weren't in the same residential college together. Plus, there was always is a matter of luck in who your roommates are. That's true of men as well. But I just wanted to say that there were a lot of very, very happy times and happy relationships as well.
And that's why I wanted to make sure to show that photo. I think you two are unique, or maybe not unique, but certainly we're lucky in both being part of an us at Yale. So Laurie, you're part of an us with that field hockey team, that group of women. And Shirley, you're part of an us with the African-American students at Yale at Afro Am House. Or I love that story of how you would find where that one cook was cooking the food that you like to eat.
Yeah. Yeah, we called him Cookie, and the chefs were rotated around the different residential colleges. And one day he came into my college, which was Timothy Dwight, TD, and the word just spread because he cooked all our home food. And so we would just send the word out, where is Cook tonight? And that college would be inundated with large numbers of Black students there for dinner. And they just kind of got used to it. But then he kind of disappeared about a year after that. So we weren't able to do that. I wanted to say one thing about the question on alienation. There was, I don't know if you all know the Hudlin brothers, but they both were Yale students. Warrington Hudlin, and I forgot his brother's name, but Warrington I had tutored him when he came into Yale, counseled him. They both have a very large Black film production company now. They made their name by producing a movie called Blacks at Yale, which interviewed, I think about 2 or 3 Black men who lived in Stiles and Morse. Okay. Now Stiles and Morse are two residential colleges that students pick out because they don't want roommates. They're either singles or doubles. Mm-hmm. And so everywhere else you have like 3 roommates or something, or 2 roommates, or even a single. But those folks who are in there, I'll have to say personally, we thought were a little strange. So for Warrington to interview them as representative of Black life, it was a terrible statement of how they were alienated from the university. And it became, I heard from people from as far away as California saying, it must have been terrible being at Yale. And I was like, what are you talking about? We had 2 Black bands And wherever they were, we went to the mixers and we jammed. We got together, we socialized. We were at the house, the Afro-America House, or the African American Cultural Center now. There was fun. Card games at night, for those of you who know about Bid Whist and Pinnacle. There were things to do, plus the courses that we were being offered, especially in the African American Studies or the Afro American Studies department. They were exciting courses, at least to me and to all of us who were attending. And the professors, we had a chance to talk to professors and interact with them. And we were doing things, you know. Vera Wells mentioned, we were one of the first colleges to host a Black Women's Weekend, which was kind of unheard of in those days, through the Chubb Fellowship funding, money funding, and L.T. Morrison, who was president of Timothy Dwight College. And nobody had ever done that before. I mean, Mary McKeeba, Nikki Giovanni, all the names in Black literature and literary prominence were there attending that weekend. So there were things that we were doing. So let me just stop because I'm mindful of the time. We had, you know, I found it very exciting and a lot of fun, but also very challenging.
Yes.
But that's college, you know. That's college.
I do have another question for you. What challenges do you believe remain today for women in higher education? And how are the challenges you faced then similar to or different from those of today?
Well, I don't think today you would find a professor telling the entire class, if there's any woman in this classroom who thinks she's going to get higher than a C grade in this course, she is sadly mistaken and can withdraw now. But that happened.
Wow.
Now, women still have challenges, but I'm always encouraged when I go back and visit Yale. I think you would be too, Shirley, that a lot of the students now don't even know that it wasn't always co-ed.
Yeah,
so that's a huge change.
I don't know if I'm encouraged by that, that lack of knowledge of the history, but it's true.
Yeah, but the fact that it's normal to them and they
Yes.
can imagine that there was a time when women weren't allowed is a good thing, and was certainly a change.
I followed Shirley and Laurie at Yale by 9 years. I arrived in 1977 as a first-year student. And by then, the gender quota had been lifted, and my class was about 40-60, a point at which you don't notice. You don't feel like you're in a minority. And that was huge. I mean, to not be in that teeny minority. I look at the numbers, and I think what I would say for women in higher ed right now are two things. One is, if you look at the upper tier, women still represent only 30% of college presidents. Yale has never found a woman it thought qualified to be its president. And I just, last night I was just curious, and I looked at the presidents of US News and World Report top 20 colleges in 2021. And of those 20 campuses, only 3 have women presidents. So that top tier, the same thing with the tenured faculty and professors, it's about a third women. So in some ways, it's hugely frustrating that still isn't at parity yet. And then the other thing is that the figure that 1 out of 5 women college students faces sexual harassment or assault at college has held through multiple studies. So even though we now have language and we now have processes, that is still a cost that women students, or a risk that women students have to take when they go to college. And I, as the mother of a daughter, I think that's unacceptable. So to me, those would be the two things that remain.
Well, and that's something you talk about in the book, how several of the female students had bad sexual experiences, either harassment or assault. And it just was never something that even occurred to them to report, because there was no one to report it to. And there was no sort of grievance structure. So they just didn't talk about it. I mean, was that your experience, being at school, that you heard about these things, or you had those experiences and you couldn't talk about it?
No, I had no experience of it. Shirley?
Yeah, I heard about it. And in fact, I had met a young woman who was a fresh woman who I just happened to meet her on the street as we were talking, and we just sat down to talk on the wall outside. And I came away from that conversation because she was utterly distressed that something had happened to her that had been bad on campus. While I tried to console her, quite frankly, I really didn't know what to do because there wasn't anything in place, anyone to refer her to. She just kind of disappeared from campus. I guess she left. I just couldn't find her afterwards to try to, see if there was some sort of support that we could provide her with. I was just thinking, to a question like that, you really just have to look at also what's going on in society for women, because colleges are like microcosms of the outer society. And the things that you mentioned and were right on point, which is like it's harder to get to the top or to break those ceilings. And the sexual harassment piece is a serious problem that hasn't been dealt with yet, and it's a serious moral problem in the country. The other thing is, I would mention that while you're looking at that, you'll see that Black women are at the bottom of the totem pole. The way things work, it's white men, Black men, white women, Black women, in terms of the socioeconomic progress, if you want to call it that's been happening. And so I would expect that numbers of Black women, if that was broken down, that you looked at, and you probably see that there were even fewer, if any, Black women in some of those positions. Even though the stereotype out there is supposedly Black women are making more money and have more jobs than Black men do, but the statistics just don't bear that out.
Yeah, well, and even that experience of being an extreme minority and what that brings. If Laurie and I were students at Yale now, as white women, we would be, we would not be in a minority. But if you were a Black woman at Yale, you would be in an extreme minority. So that persists.
Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of our program. I want to thank all of you who tuned in, and thank you so much, Anne, Shirley, and Laurie, for sharing your time and your experience with us. I can highly recommend the book. It's fascinating, and I hope you can check it out. So I'm going to end this live stream, but if you folks want to stay on, we can chat for a minute. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah.